Greetings, sir and sirettes, and welcome back to From the Depths with me, Lathrix, and of course, welcome to a bit of a different take to the From the Depths campaign. In today's video, we're just going to be taking a look at the designs we've been using throughout the campaign. I was going to use this after the finale when we finally crush the Scarlet Dawn, but I kind of just want to take a look at all of the final designs as they are before we go back into the campaign proper. So hopefully this video comes out well. I'm not used to this type of video, so let's just get straight into it. The very first design we are taking a look at is the Cornflake, of course. This was the original vehicle we made for the campaign, and easily my all-time favourite early game craft I have ever made. It sports a very simple advanced cannon, a very simple dual set of missile launchers, and that's pretty much it for weaponry. Although, even with that, it can still pack quite a punch, as we have seen it fight the Scarlet Dawn recently, and do surprisingly well. Sometimes simple is just good. The finished version of the Cornflake, which is the one you can see ahead of us, is currently at 14,000 resources and just under 1,500 volume. The Cornflake was also one of my first ever test subjects using the PID system, which is controlling all of the thrusters you can see, and the rotor blades themselves are all tied to simple control blocks. The center rotor blade, the smallest, is actually the most powerful. It's an oddly complex and yet really simple design, which I'm just happy with. Next up is the first airship of the season, which came to be known as the Blood Fang. The Blood Fang is also a bit of an experiment similar to the Cornflake. A lot of PID system work went into this, a lot of control blocks, and honestly, a lot of internal redundancy. This craft can stay in the air far longer than you may imagine for something which looks honestly quite frail. The overall volume of the craft ended up just shy of 8,000, and the overall cost is just over 40,000, which honestly isn't so bad, considering it looks far bigger than it actually is. In terms of weaponry, it has one very nasty advanced cannon, which for the longest time was using heat shells, which wasn't really the most effective for the low gauge, but it was quite a lot of fun. In addition to this, there are 3 very small flak cannons, which came actually very useful, and there are also 4 cram cannons, 2 broadsiders and then 2 on the bottom. Overall, the craft does a lot better when broadsiding the enemy than facing it head on, but either way, it was just a good jack-of-all-trades craft, and definitely in my favourites of all time. And before I forget, the final design did come equipped with missile interceptors. Not the most effective ones ever, but they were there because we had some spare space. Huzzah for lots of space armour and lots of redundancy. Next up, a bit of a fan favourite, despite the fact I actually grew to like this vehicle less and less the more I used it. It is, of course, the Malal's Will, a testament to just how many guns you can put in a rather frail frame and then simply armour it up with as much wooden armour as possible. The overall cost of this craft was just over 90,000 in its finished version, although it did go over 100,000 at one point, and its volume is around about 21,000. It did well purely because of wooden armor spam and a lot of space armor, so things like lasers and heat shells and even Hesh shells had quite a hard time killing this, even though if you actually hit the right part, it sort of detonates in one. In terms of weaponry, it has 1 major 500mm advanced cannon and then 4 250mm dual advanced cannons. Now, with the cannons, its strongest version and most expensive version was when it was using the 100mm dual advanced cannons, which was basically just spam shooting at over 1,000 rounds per minute per cannon, but sadly these caused the game to despawn the shells, because there were just too many of them. In addition to this, there are 4 very small cram cannons, 1 slightly larger on the front, and then 2 of the larger dual cram cannons, 1 at the front and 1 at the back. So lots of fairly basic weaponry which all came together to counter other large vehicles, thus making it pretty good in the later game. Now, the reason why I don't like it as much is because I feel like it was a pretty lazy build in terms of how I built it. I feel like there's too many weak points which I could have made better, and honestly I think it's kind of ugly. It's verging on hideous. But it works out, people like to see a lot of firepower, and it is fun to use. The ammo barrel, the wooden submarine with, again, weapon spam. It has 2 advanced cannons, which are both direct copies of the rapid-fire advanced cannons from the Malal's Will, just slightly toned down, and then it has a spam of missiles with delayed thrusters and very, very small torpedoes. Overall, I think this is actually a decent design, but just too expensive. It's 60,000 resources because of the weapons and the ammo and all of the stuff needed to keep it underneath the water, and its volume is only 6,000, so for volume it's pretty good, for cost not so much. Overall, I think I just needed to make this cheaper. I think it didn't need the shields and it didn't need the smoke dispensers, but I am happy I made it. I did learn a lot. With a lot of my designs, there are a lot of stuff I'm just not happy with, but as long as I learn something and can move on next time, I'm still happy enough. Still not a good builder yet, but I'm getting there. Slowly. On top of this, as you can see in the video, the weapon it used, the advanced cannons, were not good against shields. They were built around just firing as many kinetic shells as possible, which would absolutely melt armor. But even Strength 1 shields completely countered it, making it almost useless in certain fights. The first of the expensive craft and the very first retrofit. This is the Word Bearer. The original craft was the Scorpion from the Lightning Hoods, but the new version, the Word Bearer, costs a whopping 240,000 resources for 16,000 volume. The difference between the Scorpion and the Word Bearer is that the engines have been slightly increased in power by simply adding more engine to the engines, and most of the laser damage has been rerouted to the Stinger, to the tail. It's been made a little bit cheaper by removing a lot of the metal armor and replacing it with wood, and then a few more decorations have been added. A few extra missile systems and 2 very small cram cannons. It's absolutely deadly against most enemies, even those with smoke, however it is pretty frail. I'm really happy with the work I did to this craft, and the original design, the Scorpion, is utterly amazing. It's also worth mentioning the missiles this craft has, by default, are already really powerful, mostly focusing on EMP. I simply added more of them. Everywhere. The Bloodthirster. The first craft, I will say, is still unfinished to this day. That's not exactly rare with my designs, but I think this one really shows it off sometimes. There are 4 different versions of the Bloodthirster, which was used in the campaign, their cost varying from 200,000 all the way to 350,000, with the laser variants being slightly more expensive than the cram cannon variants. Either way, the main weapon of this craft is its 500mm cannon on the bottom, and the vast majority of advanced cannons on the sides, which are 250mm. Sadly, it still uses the old heat shells before the nerfs and the changes, and they are nowhere near as effective anymore. The reason why it's not finished is because of the volume limit. Back when this craft was still being used, there was a bit of a issue of spawning in too much on your side, so that the enemy couldn't spawn in anything, so anything over 20,000 was a bit of a problem. This craft was meant to have some kind of aircraft carrier capabilities on the back, hence why it's so flat, and a lot of these subsystems simply never got added. Either way though, heavily armoured, massively based off of the Blood Fang in terms of its internals, it's hard to take out of the sky, and it does have a lot of burst damage. Or at least it did before all the nerfs. I'm semi-happy with this design, and it definitely taught me a lot. Bit ugly though. The test nuke. Honestly, what is there to say about this? It's not very efficiently built. You can make flying nukes like this far, far cheaper, but I just like how it moves around like it's completely lost. It's like a fly trying to get out of a window, except for when it finally hits something, it explodes into lovely nuclear fire. It's kind of awesome in that way. So the idea is it uses control blocks and it mostly uses turrets to aim its spin blocks. So then it's always going towards where the AI is targeting, rather than trying to figure out its own movement. This means it can turn almost instantly and is always locked on. It's not the best when it comes to trying to track things which go up and down too quickly, but things like the flying squirrel with rapid short turns, it can catch up with pretty quickly. And then, boom. There are two versions of the test nuke, one which uses thrusters and control blocks. These allow the craft to set off the nukes when they are within 10 meters, and also speeds up the craft. And then a cheaper version, like the one versus the flying squirrel, with less thrusters and no control blocks, which is far less reliable, but also far, far cheaper. The next two craft were only very briefly used. In fact, the one was made, had like 2 battles, and then was instantly retired. This is the hover base and the soul cage. The soul cage was used drastically more. The hover base is a very simple floating tank. It's even legal for the Ashes of the Empire campaign. It has a 75mm advanced cannon minigun, and there's nothing really more to say about that. It's a tiny hovercraft in the shape-ish of a tank. The soul cage has flare missiles, and it spawns in the test nukes, so it's able to consistently spawn in the nukes during a battle as long as it's simply alive. And this is the problem, and why we ended up not using it too much, because it was accidentally really overpowered. A lot of enemies couldn't see it, as it was a sub, and then it just spent the entire battle spawning in nukes, which eventually caused the victory, even in battles where victory really shouldn't have been had. Right now it's a little bit broken because of some update or other, but I will one day fix this again, so it is indeed working as intended. Another one of our conversions, the World Eater, coming in at 230,000 resources and 17,000 volume. This is easily one of the most overpowered designs we had in the campaign. Designed off of the enemy Kobold from the Grey Talons, this really became utterly brutal. The original Kobold has 2 very large cannons on either side, which can pump out so much damage in a very, very short period of time directly in front of it. The left side of this craft has been kept mostly intact, with some engine conversion work and some work done to its PID system, but the right side was completely destroyed. Well, its right side if you're looking at it from the front, its left was destroyed and replaced with a massive laser, extra shielding and extra engine power. The result was a craft which could kill pretty much anything it fired at, even the very heavy enemies from the Grey Talons. It was fun, it was devastating, and it has a giant corn logo on the bottom. It looks a bit of a asymmetrical mess, but that was also the point, with hanging mainframes, wooden armor, and just fitting the theme of our corn campaign. The Madren Guard, easily the least finished of all of my craft, and that's kind of a shame really, because it is quite an interesting idea which I directly copied from the Grey Talons. The idea is the craft constantly moves backwards from the fight up until it moves to around about 2,000 meters away from the closest enemy, at which point it simply stays there and lobs long-range advanced cannons, cruise missiles and torpedoes at the enemy, with the front of the craft having very heavy shielding, very heavy armor, and a very potent anti-munition defense system, which of course is using the lasers. The reason why it's so unfinished, however, is because it was just taking so much time and the battles it was involved in were just not very fun to watch. The damage rate of this very large craft is just not high enough, and it's just hard to actually capture a battle when one enemy is 2,000 meters away and that battle is slowly shifting away further and further. It makes for some very boring content that just wasn't worth it for the YouTube channel. Still a very interesting design, and I will probably build something like this in the future, but probably smaller, with far more firepower for its size. The Changebringer, my first ever attempt at making a serious water skimmer with a medium sort of size. It ended up being just under 5,000 volume and just over 70,000 resources, making it honestly very expensive per volume, but it does have a massive laser on the top. The laser isn't the most powerful in the world, and honestly the whole creation is pretty frail, but very, very quick and very fun, sadly with limited use in the campaign just because it doesn't handle terrain very well, and there are much better uses for that volume. It has 2 custom jets which propel it at a whopping 150 meters per second, which isn't bad considering how heavy the internals are and how little fuel we are actually using up. It then has a load of very small thrusters which handle its turning and such, with a very strong PID system to make sure it doesn't flip out every 5 seconds. It's fun, it's themed around Tzeentch, and it definitely needs redoing a little bit, but definitely one of the ones I'm actually proud of. It also has several different settings to its AI, which makes it very unpredictable when moving, as you can see during this clip, which makes it very hard to hit even with very, very quick advanced cannons. Only really lasers are a major threat. The Plague Guard. Honestly, my favourite ship of the entire campaign, and the reason is, it's nothing special. Nothing to do with the Plague Guard is a gimmick, and there's no use of very fancy mechanics. It's just all of the basics crammed together into something which works way better than I ever expected. The main weapon of the Plague Guard is 5 sets of cram cannons. Each of these are of course mounted on turrets, and each of these have 3 cram cannons each. Could have said that better probably. Either way, there's a lot of cram cannons. 2 of the turrets, both holding 3, are the larger variants coming in at 1,700mm per shell, and then the smaller variants are just under 1,000. Even with this, I did look up a lot of guides, which is very rare for me, to make sure I was being as efficient as possible with the very limited space of the Plague Guard. The Plague Guard is only 12,000 volume, at least in this version, and it costs just over 140,000 resource, which is a little bit on the expensive side, but thankfully it only needs 1 boiler with a single boiler chamber to fuel the entire vehicle, so it is very cheap to simply run. Now, as for its armor, it is multiple layered almost everywhere, with space armor in the center, near the AI. The AI is also surrounded by wood and stone, which makes the whole craft very, very difficult to actually kill. As we've seen time and time again in the campaign, this is normally the last ship standing. It has hidden torpedoes at the bottom, and it has a small flat cannon and missile interceptors. The Seekers. Honestly, one of the most generic designs we currently have are indeed the Seekers. They are very cheap, coming in at only 4,000 resource, they're fairly quick at about 52 meters per second, and they have a basic missile battery and a couple of ammo barrels to support that. The reason I still use them and the reason I like them is because they come in 7 different versions, A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. The reason for this is because the Seekers are all set to different AI settings. Some of them will get closer before trying to turn away, some will get further away, and they all have different altitude settings, with some minor variation within their armor themselves. They can all heal each other if they get close enough, and they have one purpose: to distract the enemy. They are cheap things for the enemy to fire at, which aren't going to be too easy to instantly kill outside of lasers. They do very minor damage, and before version 2.0, they would have been slightly better with their missiles. Cheap, effective, and they look kinda pretty. On top of this, there is another craft which normally follows these called the Hydra. Yep, the Hydra and Seeker, it's hilarious. Either way though, the Hydra is simply a stolen design from the Steel Empire, which has been slightly retrofitted to have vehicle holders and vehicle spawners, so it always spawns in all 8 variants of the Seeker, so it's always set up that when the battle starts, they are already in the correct position, and everything works a little bit more smoothly. Don't really want to cover the Hydra too much, however, since I should not get any credit for that design. It's a great little design which has been changed over the era of the game, and I have done very little to it, other than give it one of the worst paint jobs in the world. The Skull Taker, one more of our conversions, which I'm not happy with in the slightest, despite the fact I think it looks pretty interesting. Maybe not good, but certainly interesting. I've done a pretty poor job with the overall conversion work here. I am more than aware when I make mistakes, and this is definitely one of those. It works well, and it actually does do well in combat, but I feel like it's either weaker or on the same level as its predecessor, just with a better sense of countering the enemies we were already fighting. Its weapons have been replaced with a particle cannon arm, a laser attachment to the back, and then some small missiles, and that's pretty much it. The shielding had to be slightly weakened, but everything else has been kept very much the same, except for a vastly increased engine capacity, which further reduced the armor, and then a little bit in the way of the detection system being changed to be a little bit more sensitive, since we are now using hit scan weapons. The base has been kept once again quite similar, with a lot of extra armor on the front, and of course the corn decorations. Some torpedoes have been added, and once again more engine work. I feel like I've done enough to justify this as a conversion, but it's probably one of the least converted conversions we have, except for the Hydra, which I simply don't count at all. But it did pave the way for something far more brutal down the line. It was a learning experience. not all experiments yield positive results. The Bloodhound, easily the best of the conversion work in stark contrast to the Skull Taker, both of which are mechs, but both of which are on a completely different level when it comes to their sheer power. Now, the Bloodhound is made after the Titan from the Twin Guard, and honestly, it is an absolute brute. The original Titan was already a truly fantastic design. I've just came along and then added more meta weapons and made it a little bit more on the brutish side, sadly losing the missile pods on the back, which were very intricate but also a major weak point of the Twin Guard's version. I have added a load more engine power, almost quadrupling it. It now has a dual particle cannon, which, as we've seen in the campaign, can kill even very heavily armored targets like the Madren Guard. The laser has been upped by over double as well. There are now more missiles, the advanced cannons are slightly bigger, there is more armor. It took me a very long time to make what was already a fantastic design, and whoever made that really does deserve so much respect because it was far beyond my reach. I've just added everything I wanted to, including a nice smiley face. Overall, I think it is our strongest craft, even to date, only being eclipsed by the very last vehicle we will be showing in this video. But it's very close, and in terms of cost, it definitely wins. The torso is only 200,000 and the very crudely made bottom section is around about 80,000. It's nothing special in terms of looks, the actual base itself, but it is a bundle of armor and a bundle of AI and PID. It's just impossible to sink, which is normally the weak point of these type of mechs. If the base is destroyed, the entire thing sinks. So I made sure that base will never be destroyed easily. The Fate Weaver, honestly built more as a test of the railguns themselves than a true craft. The craft itself is pretty much just that. 2 railguns strapped into the smallest vehicle I could really create to keep them mostly safe, and then given the same AI and the same tech as the Madren Guard. It constantly goes backwards until around about 2,500 meters away, and just keeps on shelling the targets with incredibly long-range missiles and 2 very deadly railguns. The problem is, with only that limited arsenal and being still mostly quite frail, it just wasn't good enough for average battles. It was niche, it was fun, it was a great test, but it certainly wasn't used all that much. Still fun to watch though, especially when it scores a direct hit. Those shells can go up to 3,000 meters per second. I did, however, forget that the finished version of the Fate Weaver does indeed use 2 particle cannons. They are not as powerful as those on the Bloodhound, but they are certainly still very, very nasty. With that, they are a little bit more reliable in terms of the Fate Weaver's constant damage per second, but still fairly niche. And finally, we have the Nihiliv, the last from-scratch creation, and definitely the creation that took the most amount of time to create, with a lot of intricate details, especially on the internals. The main weapons of this craft are 2 railguns, 2 dual railguns, which are both more powerful than the Fate Weaver's total weaponry. We have 3 separate laser systems, all more powerful than the Bloodhound. We have cruise missiles, and we also have hidden torpedoes. It is definitely one of the more brutal designs I've ever made, and we made it last because it's not really fair. This is not a design you make to be fair to the campaign, where the campaign designs have to be at least somewhat fair to you. This one simply ignores that. It has smoke defense, it has a really powerful anti-munition laser system, as a fourth laser system in fact, it has extra strong shields. It's very, very hard to kill. Now the shields are only on the weapon turrets and nowhere else, because rather than going purely into shields and needing even bigger engines, this thing already sports over 500,000 engine power, I decided just to defend the more vulnerable sections, so the turret caps and the very centre of the craft. Nowhere else has any shields. However, the armour in most places is between 6 and 7 thick, there is an abundance of heavy armour on the inside, and the armouring is honestly directly taken from the Plague Guard. I learned a lot when I built that. It's the last design for a reason, it's a load of fun to use, it's so far undefeated, and I don't think it will be in the campaign. However, there are much better designs out there than the Nihiliv just right now. This is my best design. There will be others, I'm sure of it. So with that, thank you so much for watching. If you have enjoyed this bit of a weird video, then of course, likes, favourites, shares, comments, all that good stuff helps out me, helps out the channel, and most importantly, shows that From the Depths is a series you wish to see continued in the future. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.